I've missed y'all. I was hiding out in the back last quarter. I forget what it's like to talk to adults, so if I struggle this morning, y'all help me out a little bit, okay? Glad to be back in here with y'all. I'm going to invite y'all to join me in Joshua chapter 1. We're going to make our way over there here in just a minute. You know, we're starting a new quarter today. I've got lots of handouts that we're going to work through today. Did anybody still need the handouts? I don't think did y'all need some? As we go through class, I'll be sure to kind of tell you what all this stuff is about. Some of it's for class today, some of it's for the rest of the quarter. But I just want to point out on that first page that I gave you, the Q4 syllabus, it's for both this class and for the Wednesday class. Figured I'd save a tree and print it on one piece of paper instead of two. Thank you. I'm very eco-friendly today. But as you can see, we're going to be studying Joshua here in this class this quarter, the conquest, as some people call it. Oh, my clicker's not working today. Okay. Now what? It's okay. I don't need what's behind me. We're going to be studying from the book of Joshua. And the reason I chose to study the book of Joshua is, if you recall, not last quarter, but the quarter before, we had been working through the Bible story narrative. We worked in the book of Genesis in Q1. We worked in the book of Exodus. In Q2, we took a break from the Old Testament so y'all could breathe a little bit. Now we're coming back to the Bible, or the narrative rather, the Old Testament narrative. And we're going to continue the story where we left off as the people of Israel are moving their way towards the promised land that God has given to them. And so that's what we're going to be thinking about this quarter. But I want to start by thinking about the idea of change. Who in here likes change? Likes it when things change, when situations change, when leadership changes. Does anybody like those kinds of things? I mean, some people I think are probably wired that way. They like new stuff. But as I have observed, people generally, we don't really like when things change. Now, why is that? Why don't we like change? Why are we averse to change? Okay, we think we're in control. That's part of it. Yeah, if everything's just going to continue the way that it always has, then we feel great about that, right? We think we can control our environments. Did you say something? Fear, laziness. Okay. Why do you say fear?
Well, because you don't know what's ahead. You know exactly where you're going. You know what my dad and I used to be in the same room every day.
That's right.
He doesn't know where he might stumble.
Yeah.
Fear.
Yeah, change can be unsettling, right? Because we really don't know what's ahead of us if things are changing, okay? Why else do we struggle with change? Go ahead.
That usually means we have to change accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. It impacts us, right? It impacts the way we do our daily life, maybe our habits, our relationships, the way that we think, the way that we act, especially in the context of being a Christian, right? Change is something that can be really difficult, right? Because we know that whenever we are baptized and we become new people, this life is all about change, isn't it? And that can be really challenging psychologically. It can be really challenging relationally, right? It impacts us because we are unsettled, because we don't know what's going to come next. We're out of control to a certain degree, right? There's some fear that can be associated with that. And naturally, so we're not comfortable with change, whether it's in our own lives, whether it's in leadership. I mean, think about in our nation, every 4 years we go through this business of picking a new leader. And how do people get during those seasons? I know, we just went through it, right? People get crazy, and that's because change can be very unsettling. But the fact is, change is going to come to all of us, right? It's going to come into each one of our lives, both personally, collectively as a church. You know, eventually in this church, leadership changes are going to happen. There's going to be different personalities that come in. There's going to be different personalities that leave. Some people are going to die. People that you trust, people that you respect, people that you see as pillars, they're not going to be here anymore. And what's that going to do to us as a church? What's that going to do to you in your own personal faith? I want us to think about this idea of change, because change happens in every generation. And people throughout all of time have struggled and looked for remedies for how to deal with change. And the fact is, change is not always easy. But one of the great blessings that we have in life, through our faith, is that regardless of what is going on, regardless of the change that is happening, we can have something that is stable and sure and constant. And that's what God wants us to see as His people, is that He is a constant and stable force that transcends just the present, that He's bringing His people to something greater. And that is the thought that connects us to the book of Joshua. Because as we begin the book of Joshua, they are in a season where things are about to change dramatically. Look with me at Joshua chapter 1, beginning in verse number 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving them, to the people of Israel. Now you think about this. Moses had been leading the nation ever since they came into existence, right? That from the time that they went from being slaves to being free people to becoming a nation, they have had one single man leading them. You ever thought about that? They have not known anybody else to lead them. Now they tried to put other people in there, but Moses was always that constant in their life. But now, very abruptly, Joshua chapter 1 tells us Moses is dead. Things are about to change. Imagine where the people are at in all of this. How is that going to impact them? How is that going to impact the promises of God? Have you ever thought about the challenges that they might have wrestled with? Because Moses was such a significant figure in the lives of the people of Israel. I mean, think about when they failed, who was the person that was going to bat for them? It was Moses, wasn't it? He was the one that met with God in the tent of meeting. He is the one that interceded for them. He is the one that gave them direction. He is the one that helped them to be right with God again. Moses now is gone. Who's going to fill that void? What's going to happen next? It all seems a bit abrupt as you begin the book of Joshua. But God had been preparing His people for this moment. He had been preparing a leader. Oh, there we go. Look at that. My clicker works now. He had been preparing a leader for His people. Because again, God is not bound by time. God transcends it, and God is always there with His people. So before we jump into the book of Joshua and begin looking at it, I want to take a look back for a moment and talk about how we got here to this place where they are about to enter the promised land. Now, if you remember the end of the book of Exodus, where I left off the last time that I taught, man, the people of Israel have been through a lot with God, hadn't they? They'd seen the 10 plagues. They'd seen the crossing of the Red Sea. They had seen God do these wonderful and miraculous things to prove to them His power, but also to prove to them His faithfulness. Because if you remember at the beginning of Exodus, He told them, I see you. I know what you're going through. I'm going to make you my people, and I'm going to be your God. And He had done these wonderful things for them. But how did the people of Israel treat God in the moments or the years after all of those things? Did they appreciate it? No. You know, one of the things we see from the people of God, even though God continued to extend Himself, continued to reiterate His promises, I am taking you somewhere. That's really the main promise of God. I'm taking you to a land. The people of God were constantly discontent, constantly in fear, constantly challenging God. Where are we going to eat in this wilderness? Are you kidding me? God rained food down from heaven. And they still ask Him, oh, we don't have any water here. Oh, it would have been better if we would have gone back to Egypt. Time and time again, the people of God lost sight of the God who provided for them, but also of the God who made promises to them. And that's the most important thing that's going to drive us through the book of Joshua and really through the rest of this Bible story, is that God made promises, and God always fulfills His promises. Whenever He says He's going to do something, He's going to do something. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I mean, you think about what Israel had to go through as they were wandering through the wilderness. I mean, there's some difficulty there. There's some uncertainty. There's some fear. There's some anxiety because they're out of control, right? They don't control where their food comes from. They don't control their circumstances. It was challenging. And what we saw, if you did the Bible reading last quarter in Numbers and Deuteronomy, what you saw was that the people of God, instead of learning to trust God more, what they really did is they just complained. This is not what we want. And it all came to a head in Numbers chapter 11 through 14. I'm just going to briefly rehash some of these key moments where the people of God refused to go into the land that God promised to them. You remember the spies went in, they saw the giants, they saw how wonderful it was. 10 of the spies said, there's no way we can do this. And the people listened to those men. And as a result, that generation would not get to enter the promised land. They would not get to receive the things that God had promised to them. You see, God had been working he'd gone out of his way to show them that I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. And they hadn't listened to him. My friends, we've got to appreciate that Israel's attitude, the Exodus generation that is going to perish in the wilderness, their lives are instructive to us. The writer in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 would say, don't be like them. Don't harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion. When you see God's promises and you trust God's promises, continue to trust God's promises. Because that generation is an example to us that this is not what God's people look like. They don't need to know the whole plan to trust in God. They need to know the God that they trust will be faithful. And so Yahweh's promises did not fail, but the people's faithfulness did. And so there was a generation that died in the wilderness. Everyone over the age of 20 would die in the wilderness. But there was some unfinished business that God still had from Genesis chapter 12. You remember those promises that God made to Abraham? The land promise, the nation promise, the seed promise. And God, because of who he is, was going to make good on those things. And as you get into the book of Deuteronomy, God renews his covenant with the next generation. And that's essentially what the book of Deuteronomy is about. God telling this next generation, look, I will be your God if you will be my people. Here's what it looks like. I'm taking you to a land. And I'm going to give it to you if you will listen to me. And so the book of Deuteronomy offers a profound look into the love of God and really into the heart of Moses. Because here is Moses, who is at the end of his life, and he's writing Deuteronomy, knowing that he's not going to enter the land. You remember that episode where Moses had a significant failure, where God told him to speak to the rock, and out of anger, he struck the rock and he told the people, look what I have done for you. And he wasn't allowed to go into the promised land for that reason. As he's writing Deuteronomy, he has all of these things in his mind, and yet Moses didn't give up on the promises of God. And he didn't give up on the people of God. And to his dying breath, Moses was a constant force trying to turn Israel back to God. And for 40 years, that's who Moses was. He was arguably the best leader in all of Israel's history. In fact, at the end of Deuteronomy, flip back a page to Deuteronomy chapter 34, Deuteronomy says as much. It would say this, and at the end of Deuteronomy 34, verse number 9, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. Moses' impact on the nation of Israel, and really in history, cannot be understated, because for 1,000 years after he was gone, the Jews were still saying, we got to listen to what Moses said. We know Moses is a man from God. The Jews still held him in highest regard. And so as we get into Joshua chapter 1, I ask you to do these questions. I hope you had a chance to do some of these questions ahead of time. Look at question number 3 on your worksheet. I ask you to look at Joshua chapter 1 and notice the word that is repeated. What is the word that is repeated concerning Moses all throughout Joshua chapter 1? He's a servant, right? My servant Moses. Yahweh God calls him his servant. The people recognize he is God's servant. The people also recognize that he was a servant of theirs. Why do you think that's the word that describes Moses' legacy? Why do you think that's what is emphasized, especially as we begin taking the land that God has promised? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Moses wasn't doing this of his own accord or to try to capture land or, become a great king. He was doing it to serve God and to serve the people of God. And I think it's pretty evident as you read through, that's the thrust of what God wants us to take away from that is it's not about Moses per se, or even about his people being so great that they were able to overtake all these other people. It's about God.
That's right. It puts the focus where it belongs. As great as Moses may have been, I'll say that very loosely. This was not his plan. These were not his people. He was someone that God had called. If you remember back to Exodus chapter 3, Moses didn't even want to do this to begin with, right? Remember, this is the same Moses that said, God, can you please get somebody else to do this? Because I don't want to do this. The same guy. But he was a servant. And look at what he was able to accomplish by being a servant of God. And look how God was glorified by his life. Jim?
So, he definitely was strong and he was faithful and all those good things. Do you think of anything besides maybe trying to rock that he did not come from God? So he wasn't he wasn't his own ingenuity and he was so smart and he did all these things. He just followed the Lord.
Sure.
What did the Lord say? That's what he did. And that's a great line for Paul to say, how you live your life too.
Sure. Yeah. Didn't he say he had a stutter too when he went to try to go talk to Pharaoh? I can't talk, yeah.
This perfect kind of person. God calls people that can't do it.
Yeah.
So they don't have the ability that he gives them to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you're bringing all this up because, the fact is being called a servant, I think, helps position Moses in our minds properly, especially as we're going and looking at this period of change, right? Because, again, in the minds of the people, think about how massive Moses must have been, right? This is our leader. What are we going to do without him? He was my servant, God says. And what God's going to do and build on top of that is, he's gone, but I'm still with you. I'm still with you. No?
I was also thinking that being a servant for the people, he was an intercessor between God
That's right.
and the people. Whether it was good, usually God to Moses was good stuff for the people to Moses to God wasn't. Can you imagine?
Sure.
That we would call it hey.
Sure.
Dealing with these people like this.
Yeah.
And that made him, he was a very strong person.
Yeah. And being remembered as a servant, I think, demonstrates his commitment to the people. Because there were times Moses was like, I'm done. There were times God was like, I'm done. But they were never there at the same time, thankfully. But you're exactly right. It shows that he had that commitment to serving other people. I think that's an important thing we ought to see from the life of Moses. Go ahead, John.
Numbers 12:3 says Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. So it wasn't, again, him trying to take leadership or elevate himself. But he was very humble.
It's always been interesting to me. Can we really trust that? Because those are the words of Moses about himself. I am the most humble man in the world. I'm kidding. It's written there for our learning and our instruction. You're exactly right, though. He was. And we see that. And consequently, what we really need to see of Moses is he's a prefigure of the Christ. That's what Deuteronomy 34 is really pointing us to, because when Jesus comes onto the scene, it will say Jesus is greater than this prophet Moses. No prophet has risen like Moses until Jesus shows up. And he's the greater, more perfect mediator, greater, more perfect leader. In fact, he's so much better than Moses that he doesn't just get to see the promised land. He takes God's people into the promised land. Unlike Moses. Moses didn't get to do that, did he? Unfortunately. One of the greatest leaders of all time, Moses, is remembered as a servant. But we need to understand what being a servant meant and looked like. We already kind of talked about some of these scenes, but think about how he served the people by going to Pharaoh and standing up for the people, right? Again, it's what God wanted him to do, but that's how he served the people. He did what God called him to do, and he was strong and he was courageous in that moment, wasn't he? He spoke very plainly to the most powerful man in the world. Moses served the people by listening to their complaints, listening to their wants. Man, during the wilderness years, they did a lot of that complaining, didn't they? They were always wanting something. This food stinks. We're tired of this. I can imagine there were probably moments when Moses was like, are you kidding me? This food is raining down out of heaven in the wilderness, and you want to complain about it? We got nothing else, right? These are Daniel's words if I was in Moses' sandals. Man, those people, they were something else. But Moses served them. He listened. He interceded for them. In very critical moments, as Noel brought up, you think about the golden calf incident. God was ready to destroy them. Moses served them not because he liked them, but because he cared about them. He cared about God's honor and God's legacy, and he said, God, these are your people. And so it's not about how I feel about these people. It's about how I feel about you. That's an important lesson for us when we think about service, because the fact is there's going to be times when you don't like the people of God, but you got to love them and serve them like Moses for the glory and the honor of God. Think about that. He served them by chastising them and admonishing them. In fact, a big chunk of Deuteronomy, some of his final words to Israel is, hey, you're stubborn. You people, y'all aren't very great, but if you turn to God and you do what he says, he will listen to you. Moses said things very plainly, and all of this was motivated by his commitment to be the leader God called him to be. That's such an important reality for us to see. Moses didn't put himself here. God chose him. God called him, and Moses obeyed all that the Lord had commanded him. You remember in the book of Exodus, as he's building the tabernacle, God had given him all of these instructions, and I mean, they are meticulous. And the end of Exodus, Moses goes through all that stuff and he obeys all that the Lord commanded him. He was meticulous because he cared about what God said. He realized this wasn't his house. This wasn't his idea. This wasn't his decision to lead. He needed to do what God wanted him to do. We need to take some lessons there from Moses. And so I think it's important as we begin the book of Joshua to think about this man Moses who served God's people, to position them in this place where they are on the brink of one of the greatest promises that God has ever offered his people, a place of their own. Now, they've already become this great nation, right? They become the great nation. They did that while they were in Egypt. But they've not had a place to call their own, and now they are looking at this place to call their own. But as Deuteronomy comes to a close, Moses is gone. Moses, my servant, is dead. It seems very abrupt when you read that in Joshua chapter 1. But not only did God have a plan for his successor, he had a plan for their future that predated any of the people during this time. And so as we get into the book of Joshua, the theme of Joshua is very simple, and it addresses the greatest certainty of life with the greatest comfort of faith. And that is, regardless of what is going on, regardless of the change that is happening, regardless of the uncertainty that we might have in our own lives about what the future will hold, God is with his people wherever they go. And so God's people should be strong and courageous. That's going to be the theme for our study this quarter. Thinking about what it means to be strong and courageous and take hold of God's promises. Because the fact is, if we believe that God is faithful to his promises, that God will do what he said he will do, that he will bring us to this land that he has prepared for us, then that ought to encourage us. That ought to empower us. That ought to help us to do what we know is right by following God. Now, if you read Joshua chapter 1, you see this phrase, be strong and courageous, 4 times. Look with me, verse number 6. Joshua chapter 1, this is God speaking to Moses. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. This is God's admonition, and he would say it again. Joshua would say it God would say it in chapter 1 and verse number 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Now, when God says something once, we ought to listen to it, right? When he says something twice, he's emphasizing it. When he says it 3 times, he's saying, if you didn't get it the first 2 times, you need to pay attention to what I want you to hear from me. And it's important to see the context. What's the context in which God is saying, be strong and courageous to Joshua? What's going on here? He's got a pretty big task in front of him, right? And I wonder, there were some failures along the way in terms of fighting and battles and the people not doing what God called them to do. And Joshua had seen all the things that Moses had been through with the people, right? Surely some of these things are weighing on him. But then there's ahead of him. There's the conquest. He knows we're about to go to war here. That's what's about to happen in the book of Joshua. And so God comes to him and says, be strong and courageous. John?
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning, Moses had died, but a whole lot of other people had died too.
Great point.
All the older people that they had relied on for wisdom and strength and courage were gone.
That's a great point.
So it's only those that were younger that were going in.
Yeah, that's a great point. Again, it's a period of change. Yeah. Who are the new leaders going to be? What is this going to look like? Who can we really trust? What God is saying is, you can trust me. It doesn't matter who comes and goes. What matters is that I am a constant force in the lives of my people who listen to me and do all that I command them.
It's kind of putting ourselves in their shoes. Most people don't like conflict.
Okay.
So Daniel Lee walks in and says, okay, we're putting together an army, we're going to invade Weatherford.
I'm out. No.
Yeah, exactly my point. Is that most people are not militant like that in order to go in and take other people's lives and their goods.
Yeah. Well, and just before this, we didn't mention this, but the king of Sihon, the king of Og, those were some really big kings and kingdoms that Israel had to go to war against. And surely they saw, man, if we're going to have to be doing this is hard work, right? This is a lot of effort. You're exactly right. It can be daunting when you see the enemies in front of you and you think, I got to keep doing this. This conquest is going to take a toll on us, right? The natural mind is going through all of these things. And that's why God continues to reiterate, I'm giving you the land. Be strong and courageous. Go take hold of it. You don't have to think about how to take hold of it. You just have to do what I tell you to. And that's what we're going to see from stories like Jericho and others throughout the conquest. This is God's gift to them. This is God's efforts. If they will follow his marching orders, they will take the promises and the land that he has given to them. Jim?
This is unconquerable land, right? This is full of giants.
Okay.
And these were not warring people. These people were warring. It was unconquerable. And I've always thought that the River Jordan and crossing the River Jordan was going into the promised land of the last days. But I moved away from that really. Maybe it was at the end, but the River Jordan represented our own baptism. The unconquerable land is our own heart. And he said, with my help, you have strongholds, you have those that are against you, you have your own enemies, and most of the enemies are within. He said, you cannot conquer your own heart and serve me without it.
Sure.
Right? And I think that's what he's telling them is, you gotta be strong and courageous, you gotta have a lot of faith, and you just have to continue to move forward where you see, we all have these strongholds, right?
Sure.
We have these battles we fight with them. He said, I can help you win, but if you try to move by yourself, you will lose everything.
Yeah.
And that was, you have to be strong and courageous and believe that God can help you.
Yeah. But notice that it is God who is coming to Joshua. And notice it is God who is encouraging him because he wants them to take the land. God's not messing with Israel. He's not saying, hey, good luck. He said, I want you to have this. My friends, we got to realize this about God's heart. When he makes promises, he's not just saying good luck. He's saying, I got you. I'm going to help you get the things that I have promised to you. I'm the strong one here. But you got to be strong and courageous. It takes effort on our part as well. But knowing that God is on our side is important. I was talking to my girls about this, and I was just thinking about, there's so many times they're so afraid. Of course, I have little girls. We were looking out the window, and they thought they saw somebody peeking in the window. It was just the shadow of a tree. They were terrified. They ran over to me, and they huddled up around me. I said, I'm not going to let anybody get you. Everything's going to be fine. I said, that's how God is. If God is with us, we don't have to be afraid of what's in front of us. It might still be daunting, But if God is with us, we can be strong and take courage. And we can take hold of the promises of God. Jessica?
I think it's interesting that the command to be strong and courageous is twofold. It's be strong and courageous to take my land, but it's also be strong and courageous to keep my law. And, Moses didn't have the law. Moses didn't have the law the whole time he was leading. Joshua has the law. And God, I think, is telling him, you're going to be different. As a nation, you're different. You're my nation of priests. And you have to meditate on my law and keep my law because you are going to be different. And you can't let these outside influences of the nations come at you and influence you. You have to keep studying my law.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, he brings their attention back on him and what he's given to them. Yeah, that's a great point. Hadn't thought about that. Go ahead, Noel.
It's interesting how back in, this was also something that was told to Moses. So this is something
That's right.
to do. And then when you go up to the Psalms, David says something like, be strong and let your heart take courage for all who hope in the Lord.
That's right.
So this is something that is not just for Joshua. This is for anybody that believes in the Lord.
Yeah.
Even today, we need to, and I guess that's why we're studying this.
That's right.
We have to look at this.
That's right.
We have to make sure that we're courageous, that we're strong, that we can stand up, that our heart will not sink.
Yeah, and the more I thought about this, we don't have a big role, a role in terms of how we defeat the enemies. Our role is to trust God who will defeat the enemies, and be strong as we take the land. Because you think about, for instance, as Israel goes into the promised land and they're going against these strongholds, there's going to be a time when 5-6 kings get together and fight against them, right? And God's saying, all you have to do is go take hold of it. I've already done the work for you. They had to take courage and all of that. And you're exactly right. We have to train our hearts and trust to be courageous. You're exactly right. And it's interesting, you talk about this thought being transcendent throughout all of history. I mean, this was a message that God had been feeding Joshua long before he took over. In fact, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses, verse 6 through 7, Moses calls Joshua, after he's given the law, he calls Joshua. Look at verse number 6. Moses would say this to Joshua, be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all of Israel. So he doesn't just tell it to him personally, he says it in front of everybody. Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to you. This is a mantra that God's people ought to be living with as they go in and they take the promises. This is the mantra that we as the people of God ought to be living with as we wage war not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the forces of darkness, the things that are assaulting our heart. With the word of God, we fight back. We are strong and we are courageous because we trust in the promises of God. And so as they entered this season of change, God wanted them to not only have hope, but to have courage, to have strength, that they would receive the things promised. That's the thing I want us to latch on to as we study Joshua, because God's promises are not that different for us today. We are people looking for a homeland, right? Hebrews chapter 11, seeking things above. We are often distressed on every side. We're often uncertain about what the future holds. God wants us to know that with Him, we are more than conquerors. That by faith, we will inherit the promises. And that no matter where we go, He is always with us. The Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So the book of Joshua just reminds us that God's presence and power transcend just the present. But more importantly, it shows us that God fulfills His promise by bringing His people home. And so as we go through the book of Joshua, what we're going to see is that it's a book of hope, of fulfillment, of victory, because God is with His people. And something to keep in mind as we're looking at the book of Joshua is that doesn't mean that God's people are always perfect still. The last generation, it's really easy to throw rocks at the Exodus generation because they were a whiny group of people. right? They rejected God. They did some pretty brazen things. The generation that came after them was a lot better than them, but they weren't perfect either. In fact, there's a big section in Joshua chapter 7 through 9 where we see they had some pretty significant failures in their trust of God. They went and did things their own way, and it didn't work out well for them. But the difference between that generation and the previous generation is they learned from their mistakes. They listened to God. They made the changes they needed to make, and they repented. And God blessed them, and they took the land that He promised. So I want to grab your syllabus. I just want to run through here real quick and let y'all kind of get a feel for what we're going to be doing this quarter. As you can see on the syllabus there at the top, each week we're going to cover about 1 to 2 chapters a week. There's one exception there. You can see it's February the 2nd. We're going to be drinking through a fire hose that day. About 5 or 6, I don't remember, can't do the math there, 8 chapters there. But that will largely be, we'll be blitzing through that because it's just names and peoples and things. But for the most part, we're going to be taking 1 to 2 chapters a week. And so since this is a survey class, we're not going to hit everything. But I plan to camp out on 4 key themes that we'll see throughout. And they're found here in Joshua chapter 1. In verses 6 and 7. And I've put it up here on the screen so you can see it here. This is God speaking to Joshua. He would say, "No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them." You see how all of that's a promise from God? That's one of the biggest themes of Joshua. God makes promises. And God's presence is with them. Just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. And I will protect you. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. He's there to help them in their time of need, and He gives them exactly what they need and so much more. You shall cause this people to inherit the land. What I want us to see as we study through Joshua is that when God makes promises, He equips His people to receive the promises. But we must be strong and courageous and take hold of what God has promised. So this is just kind of a brief overview of the book of Joshua. I see it as divided into kind of 4 big chunks. The beginning of Joshua chapter 1 through 6, they enter the land. God is with them. He renews His covenant with them. He empowers them. You see the hope and the purpose and the drive of the people to inherit the promises of God. Then, as I mentioned, chapter 7 through 9, the human element comes into play. God's people go their own way. They don't do exactly what God tells them to do, and it always ends up poorly. Those kind of deviations happen in every narrative in the Bible story, just to remind us that there's a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. But God's way is always the right way and the best way. And so it's kind of a short little detour for 2 chapters. And then chapters 10 through 22, they take the land. They make it very explicit that they go in and they conquer this land that God has given to them. They are given their inheritance. And then the book ends with a covenant renewal and a funeral as Joshua says his farewell to the people that he has led to take the land. Any questions, comments, thoughts at this point about our study in the book of Joshua? Okay, I want to take just a moment and talk about Joshua, the man. I think this will help us in understanding what he's about to do and what he's getting himself into. There on your worksheet, question number 1, I asked you to notice these different roles that Joshua filled. And just for the sake of time, I'll just ask you, what were some of the roles that Joshua filled prior to becoming the leader of Israel? Okay, he was Moses' right-hand man, right? He was his personal assistant. Joshua was the one when Moses went into the tent of meeting outside the camp where he went by himself, Joshua would stand outside, right? He was there with Moses in very key and critical moments of Moses' leadership. So he has seen a lot of what Moses has done. Okay, what else?
He was one of the 2 spies that came back and said, "We can take the land."
That's right. You know, that is one of the most, I think, telling scenes of the character of Joshua, because here's a man who's one of 12, and when they come back from spying out the land, 10 of them say, oh no, we can't do this. There's no way. And yet Joshua and Caleb didn't just say, yes, we can take it. They pleaded with the people. They tried to change their minds. They said, please don't do this. Trust in God. Doesn't that tell you something about Joshua? He was the kind of person that, one, he was willing to stand up against the majority, but also he had conviction about doing what is right, convincing the people to have courage. You know, I see him as someone who already had this innate sense of courage to do the will of God.
Almost like David, whenever they were fighting Philistines, he had that same kind of.
That's right. Yeah, and God, it's something that God equipped him with. It's something that God chose him for this reason, because he knew that he could handle this. What else? Were there any other roles that Joshua had before taking over?
He was the battle commander.
That's right. That's right. He knew how to fight, right? He was the one that said, let's go take these people, right? There were multiple times we see him as a military leader. And that's going to be key, because they're going into the conquest, and you need somebody that knows how to fight. You need somebody that people will trust. And that's what we see as we get into Joshua chapter 1. The people trust Joshua. There's no qualms about his leadership. And some of that is because God had prepared him, right? God had prepared him personally, but he had also prepared him in front of everybody else. Just for the sake of time, question number 2 there on your worksheet. If you look at those verses, what you see is there were moments when God said, Moses, take Joshua up on the mountain in the sight of all the people, and take the priest with you, and make sure they know he's going to be the next leader. I have chosen him. God made sure the people knew, this is my leader for you that I have chosen. He made these public displays. There were pronouncements, there were encouragements from Moses, because this was a monumental task for Joshua during a transitionary period for Israel. But God ensured that he had encouragement and that he had confidence to do the work. And that brings us to Joshua chapter 1 that I just want to briefly look at this morning. If you'll grab your third, this page that I gave to you, this is an outline of Joshua chapter 1 that after I printed it, I realized I didn't put anything that says Joshua chapter 1 on it. So if you want to write that on there for future reference. But this kind of shows us what the chapter looks like. And there's two main things that happen in Joshua chapter 1 that kind of parallel each other. The first 9 verses, God talks to Joshua. And then the second half of the chapter, Joshua talks to the people. And these two interactions almost identically parallel. If you notice what I've got here, when God comes to charge Joshua, he commands him to take action. There in chapter 1 and verse number 2, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land that I'm giving you. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. He gives some very specific commands of crossing over to this land that I will give to you. And you'll notice down there, as Joshua relays all of this information to the Israelites, he says the same thing. We're going to cross over this Jordan, and we're going to take this land that God is giving to us. It's important to see that what God is telling Joshua as encouragement is what Joshua is telling the people. That's what a man of God looks like. He's somebody that takes confidence and courage in the word of God. And then you see God encourages Joshua. He says, you can do this. Be strong and courageous. I'm going to be with you wherever you go. And that's the same encouragement that he gets from the people. You know, he goes and he tells the eastern tribes, y'all got to cross over with us. I know your inheritance is over here on this side of Jordan. Y'all got to go with us. And they said, we're with you. Be strong and courageous. We're going to go with you wherever you go. Just a couple things I want us to see from Joshua chapter 1 is that Joshua understands his role very clearly as he goes into this. He's been listening to God, and he's going to do what God says. And he's leading with confidence because he knows that this land is a gift from God, but they have to go and take the land. My friends, that's what we're going to think about. If we trust the promises of God, we need to be strong and courageous. We need to go take the things that God has promised to us. That's what we're going to be thinking about this quarter. Thank you for your thoughts. I'm going to send out these questions on the Monday Minute for next week. Be looking for that. We'll start with Joshua chapter 2 next week. Thank you for your time and attention.